my great pleasure to introduce today Nicola Wall of Fortiori Development, excuse me. Dr. Wall has over 20 years experience in the healthcare arena. She's worked with some of the largest companies in the world to design processes aimed at improving the conduct of clinical research. She has managed clinical trials across 36 countries and all areas of the clinical trial process. And during her PhD, Nicola worked for the NHS, which really enabled her deep understanding of the hospital environment that's so critical for the solid execution of a clinical trial. Nicola then formed Fortiori Development, a clinical research organization and a valuable partner that provides stewardship and advocacy to companies as they strive to provide the appropriate clinical evidence in support of regulatory approval and commercial success. And if you'd allow me a little editorializing there, what Nicola does so well for our startups is to get you guys thinking about clinical trial design from the very earliest stages, so that the things that you are striving to validate will come to fruition when you go forward to putting in your trials. Nicola is also a member of the EIT Health Mentoring and Coaching Network. She's based in Galway in Ireland. At that, I'm going to stop chatting. I'll just mention a little procedural stuff here before I completely pass over to Nicola. We have a chat function. Feel free to pop some things into it, say hi. But if you have questions, try to use the Q&A function. It just makes it a lot easier for us to kind of moderate the session. We've also already started recording so that we can put this session live later on. So bear that in mind. For the most part, we'll kind of keep the Q&A towards the end, and I'll be helping to kind of moderate that session, and we'll have a little chat about it. So at that, I'm going to switch off my camera and zip the lip and pass over to Nicola.
Thank you very much. So let me share my screen here, and it's wonderful to be able to be here and present to you all. So thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Alla, for the opportunity to speak about, of course, something, as I'm sure you know, is very dear to my heart, which is all around clinical research. So, you know, really just to, I suppose, set the scene for what we would, you know, like to get through today for everyone, is to recognize that this is a journey, and it's a journey that is worthy of great respect, because those of you who have made this decision to go out into the world and try and develop something in terms of an intervention to improve patients' lives deserve all the respect and kudos in the world. So, you know, as Rosemary mentioned, I've been involved in clinical development in one form or another for over 20 years, and actually the team here at Fortiori, a lot of people like myself that have been around the block. So, you know, part of what this presentation is today is to give you a snapshot of what's actually a lot of different moving pieces, and I think you'll probably understand that, you know, by the end. But also, you know, to try and give you the benefit of some of the things that we've learned along the way, some of those hard lessons that we've learned along the way. So again, hope there's plenty of questions at the end. We'll build in time. I will try and stay within the hour, but we've quite a lot of material to get through. So I am going to get started, and I am going to stop my video as well so I can concentrate on looking at my slides. So really what we want to cover today is, you know, what is a trial? Why do we need a trial? And some of you are probably thinking, why on earth would we even need to talk about that? But we do. And I think it's a worthy exercise to actually go through, you know, the different reasons around the trial, and there's the motivation behind that is to help people understand all the different elements that you have to consider when you're actually thinking about and planning the trial. Obviously, what is a good trial, you know, to also provide some of our learning around, you know, the most important things to consider. And of course, you know, we only have an hour to go through a lot of this stuff, but I'll do my best to cover the salient points of what is a good trial and what's exactly involved in running a trial. And then, of course, the take-home lessons, you know, those things that we really want you to remember at the end of the presentation. So I suppose the thing to remember always at the end of the day is, you know, and again, people I think unfortunately maybe pay lip service to this, but at the end of the day, anything to do with clinical research involves people and patients, and in many respects, patients, subjects, participants, all of that different, the ways of describing those extremely important people that you will be looking to participate in a clinical study about your product or your intervention. So, it's always good to start off and remember who's at the heart of all of this, right? So again, in terms of, what is a trial, let's go back to some basics here. A trial is about an intervention, and we call it an intervention because there's so many different things. People immediately think about drugs and devices, but there's also, there's many, many studies that are done around different types of changes in procedures and how other things such as diet and these kinds of things can also be part of a clinical study. I suppose in many respects, again, it's comparing a new approach to a standard one is a very, very common type of a trial. And I'm sure, as many of you are aware, the whole thing around a placebo intervention, and in devices we call that a sham intervention as well. So where you're measuring, against a sort of, I suppose, the lack of intervention versus what your intervention would potentially do. So in terms of, what you're actually doing, it's really to ascertain, is this product going to be helpful? Is it going to be harmful? Is it going to be any different to what's already out there? These are all the kinds of things that at the end of the day are really important considerations for your trial. But at the end of the day, it's about the investigators, so the docs that you're going to work with to determine the safety and the efficacy of your intervention, right? That's really what this comes down to. So I think it's worth saying here that, again, many people that come to us, I suppose, if anything, there's a few different types of studies that we mainly deal with. But just to be clear, there are a number of different types of research and types of trial and types of trial design. Now, I'm going to try and cover what I can with trial design today, but it's worth mentioning that as a piece of work in and of itself is huge. And we can give some more information at the end. There's some other webinars that are recorded about that, but I'm going to try and give you a high level today. But really, there are many different types of research, and we've listed just, some of the usual suspects on this slide. And of course, many of you will be familiar with randomized control trials and indeed pilot and feasibility studies and usability studies. So of course, at the end of the day, call them what you will, they are essentially all different types of clinical studies or clinical trials. And again, never forget, this is about getting data. This is about what kind of study you need to get the data that you need. So again, with a nod to the famous trial, I suppose, the randomized control trial, and as you can see here, carefully planned experiments, right? It allows for comparison. And many people will say that the randomized control trial is a gold standard. And of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, RCTs in and of themselves are coming under a lot of scrutiny, particularly in the last number of years, and they are not always the right choice. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, this is the main type of trial that most of you will be familiar with. So we just wanted to kind of call it out there and give you the really good tight definition of what that is and why it's really, really important. So why do we need a trial? So this is a summary of some of the most important considerations that any company should be really, really thinking very long and hard about while they're in that process of trying to determine exactly what kind of study. And there's a very important reason for putting up this slide, and that is that we constantly urge companies to think about the fact that there are so many important considerations that should actually inform the choice of trial, and exactly the type of trial that you want to run, right? And I think, again, and we've put regulatory up here as number one, because at the end of the day, a lot of companies that come to us, the first thing that they're concerned with is the regulatory requirement, and rightly so. However, there is a number of other considerations that are listed under that. And again, it's you know, there are times when it's sad but true, but I think companies actually lose sight of all of those other reasons as to why they're actually running a study. And, you know, safety is number two. You know, there's a lot of assumptions, you know, that companies, you know, it's going to be fine. We've bench tested it. We've done this, that, and the other. Well, actually, the only real way to test it is to test it in a clinical environment with those lovely humans that you're going to need to test it on. So safety and making sure that your product, as it says here, provides sufficient assurance that your product is safe and all risks have been identified and mitigated. And that can only be done with sufficient testing. So the next factor here that we talk about is market and reimbursement. And again, this is an incredibly important question. And I think what, you know, we have found in our experience is that, believe it or not, this question gets lost in the beginning because, you know, people, particularly, let's say with respect to the US market, for example, you know, they get hung up on the idea of getting a particular code for a product and think that that's going to solve all their problems and that the product will fly off the shelves. And what we're here to tell you is absolutely not. You know, your market and what your market needs. So everyone from not just your patients and your clinicians, but your institutions, your insurance companies, your government payers all over the world have their own set of requirements when it comes to proving, you know, what level of proof and evidence they want to see. So that's all comes under this heading of market. And that's a thing to consider very, very carefully in the beginning stages of planning your studies. The next thing is investors. And again, I'm sure as most of you will know, or you will have had conversations already, more and more now, investors are looking to see what your clinical plan is. What is your plan to gather the evidence that you need on your product, that it does what you say it does, and provides the assurance to all of those other lovely people in the market that it does what you say it does and that it's safe. So again, investors are looking to see what your plan is around your clinical trials and what the strategy is in terms of how you're going to approach that. So, you know, again, as a lot of you will move forward into, you know, getting investment, this is something to be concerned about and to understand what those requirements might be in terms of those investors looking for your plans. Okay, so again, it's having a good clinical development plan overall that will really facilitate that process. Of course, independent verification, you know, again, it's running a study that's technically at arm's length, so that there's a set of clinicians that will be verifying your product in the clinical setting that it works. So it sounds obvious, but I think, again, there is just a great deal, unfortunately, of hubris, for want of a better word, in terms of what people think and believe about their products. But you have to remember, at the end of the day, it is very much about that independent verification. Insight, again, you know, particularly around the design of pilot and feasibility studies and usability studies, you know, putting together these really small initial studies are incredibly valuable and important. And the reason you do that is to gain insight, is to actually, you know, test a particular prototype. And, you know, it can reveal all kinds of things that might not have been thought about. And, you know, if you were to perhaps jump into a much larger study without doing a pilot, again, these are the types of things, depending on, you know, what your product is, you know, the smaller pilot and feasibility study can provide some really important information before you would move forward into a much larger study. So, of course, that would be a reason to run that type of study. And last but by no means least is intellectual property. And it's incredibly interesting to really understand how data can be, you know, obviously extremely important for filing and for evidence in terms of your patent. So really important to consider that upfront and to have, you know, important conversations with your patent attorneys and those representatives that are pulling together that information for you, because there will be a requirement around the data and the evidence. And the sooner you understand what that is and build it into your design, the better. So all that being said, what is a good trial? So as I suppose conveniently just talked about literally a minute ago, it's about clinical development planning. And if I could again start with these take-home messages: planning, planning, planning as soon as you can. It's we've got another slide here that I've peppered throughout this presentation, and again, it's to remind people of the sheer number of moving parts that they have to consider while they're thinking and talking about the potential for their study. And there's a lot of considerations, and there's a lot of time considerations, and timelines for different things. They can overlap, but they can conflict, right? So it's understanding as soon as you can in your process. For example, the intellectual property consideration is a good one, because actually, depending on when your requirements are for filing, could actually influence when you run a study, to know that you can actually run the study in time to provide data that would support that filing. So as an example for that, ISO requirements, particularly for devices. So what I can say about that is, we have seen companies unfortunately come unstuck with this, with not fully understanding everything from sterilization, for example, being a good one. Knowing how long the lead time is to get that off to a particular lab if you need to do that. And not only that, but there's depending on what your product is, you'll know this already, but there will be a number of ISO standards around what you need to do to provide additional levels of assurance around different things to do with that product. Manufacturing timelines, we've seen this with some companies take an incredible amount of time that just wasn't, even irrespective of COVID, even before that. We'll keep the mention of the C word to a minimum today, but even prior to this, I think there are some massive considerations, particularly, a lot of them driven by the changes with the MDR, but around the manufacturing and what the requirements are. So understanding how that all maps out. We've talked briefly about the market needs. Again, what's your end game? So what are you doing to address that in your study? Knowing all of this as soon as you can about where your primary markets, again, will be, will really help inform a really good market plan overall, and of course a clinical development plan, because that's what this is all about. In terms of the funding needs, unfortunately can be a chicken and egg situation, as again I'm sure many of you are aware of. But your understanding, and I suppose this is such an incredibly important another take home here, understanding what kind of trial you might potentially need as much as possible is a fundamentally critical thing, because only then can, and any company such as ourselves, such as other great providers out there that help and run clinical trials, can you even get an idea of what your cost will be. And so, for many people that we've worked with, we've been able to help figure out exactly what your clinical development plan should be, so that you know how much money it is that you actually need to go out and raise, so that you have the ability, to pay for that. And we'll come back to that. Another one of the favorite topics. And last, but again, by no means least, your competitor considerations. As you're out there looking at, how great your product is. Again, it's always a bit worrying to see that that companies haven't truly done a good landscape assessment in terms of all of the various competitors. Not the obvious ones that you might even have used in your 510K, but really, the broad spectrum of things that are already out there in development, and having a really good understanding of what's being done in your space, not just prior to, but also concurrently. Because again, as you look to design your study, you're also needing to understand, what it is about your product that's either, better or different to what's out there on the market. So as you, craft the right clinical development plan, those considerations, of course, are incredibly important as well. So I'm going to try and sum up some absolutely massively important considerations around clinical study design. And again, there's so much information to cover here, but we'll certainly talk with Ro and the guys about doing a separate webinar. But if I can maybe at least call out these things, some of which now we've already spoken about, but the whole point here is that a good trial and a really good, well thought out design that's done in a very particular way is absolutely critical, because it does so many important things, some of which are listed here. But in many cases, what we will be seeing and what we've already started to see in our experience is that actual statistical powering that's done for your trial will be, part of a regulatory scrutiny that your product will go under. So not only that, but you want to actually know that the number of patients that you need is enough, and that it's not too much to get the information that you want from your study. So, two really important things and questions that we get asked all the time. And I think our regulatory friends, the same thing. How many patients, how many patients, how many patients? Well, there's really only one way to know. And there are different considerations around the pilot study and any kind of feasibility and usability studies. I think we all know that. But when it comes to anything else, the statistical powering and the reasoning behind that is incredibly important to understand, to get that number correct, so that your study is then, designed to have the right number of people to answer the questions that you need answered. So I suppose, again, for this third bullet, planned assessments, trial design, again, is very much about your hypothesis. What question or questions do you want to answer? And that's very closely linked with this next one around endpoints. So as you're looking to design your study, it is incredibly important that you have the right endpoints. And sometimes that might seem obvious, but actually it isn't, because believe it or not, the exact wording on your endpoints and what it is that you're trying to do in your study is really important. It can affect your statistical powering. It can affect your ability to select the right, let's say, questionnaires, for example, because we said here, the assessments. All of those things, really, really important to have the right people. And that's not just having clinical endpoints. This is also where biostatisticians become incredibly helpful, because their take on how exactly, you will come up with the right wording is we've seen makes a huge difference with some of the trials that we've been involved in terms of a trial actually being not only useful, but also attainable. So in terms of usability feedback, and I think a lot of people in the early stage, this is a really important thing to consider is, we talked briefly about it on the couple of the last slides, is understanding about your product itself. And there's different requirements around that. And all we say to people is, if you're going, to the extent of getting your product into the hands of a clinician, you need to be really careful about what it is you're asking them to gather and how you can make the most of that opportunity. So, that's still a study, a trial. Like I said, we use these words interchangeably. So there's still considerations and conversations to be had around that, and around the fact that, particularly depending on your class of device, you can't just go and do certain types of studies without ethical approval. And I think we have seen where companies have not fully understood those requirements. So always good to have a conversation with people in the know about exactly where the line is between usability feedback and a study and what it is you're trying to do. So always come back to the evidence. What's the evidence that I'm going to need, at this particular point in time? And we'll come back to that as well. Your market requirements, I said this before, and the reimbursement, of course, they are slightly different. Your market overall could be to do a lot more with things like, particularly in the drug world, we've seen things like formulation, and actually how many times a day you'd be required to take something, make a huge difference in, your product and what it is that you could be looking to do in terms of a study. So really important to think about that. But I suppose more specifically, reimbursement questions, knowing potentially what it is that, and again, this is particularly relevant for the American market, is really understanding what the evidence requirement will be for some of those, what we call payers out there, that will want to know and want to understand what evidence you have about your product. And it's engaging with the right people. And there's some fantastic experts out there that can really speak to that and help give you that knowledge that you need, so that when you are looking at your trials and the types of trials you need and what it is you want to find out in those trials, that you've had time to think about all of these things, how they can be answered and addressed in the study. And again, to make sure that if, when you are going to do the study, that you've thought about all of these things. So it's my scary slide. So the whole point of this is to give you a snapshot of all of the many, many different moving parts. I'm not going to be able to speak to all of these today, but I'll do my best to at least mention most of them. But really, this is an evolving concept, I think, for many, many people, is to really understand all of these moving parts when it comes to clinical development. And when we say clinical development, really, I suppose, just to be clear, a clinical development plan is something that we would have been used to in the drug world, but is obviously just as relevant in the device and any kind of, let's say, intervention. That you understand how it is that you're going to go through the process of providing evidence on your product that it's safe and effective, right? So there are lots of different things to think about, and overall a clinical development plan will help you understand how many different types of trials you need to run and when and all those kinds of things. And this gives you, I suppose, a snapshot of all of those different things. So we have broken them down a little bit more, and I will go through them as best I can. But this is to remind everybody that, again, this journey that you're on is not an easy one. It's a doable one, and especially when you plan in advance. So I'm hoping that that's becoming, very evident here. It's all about planning, and it's all about having the right information. So that being said, the next part of, what is a good trial is also, where are you running that trial and why? And when we say healthcare setting here, it's just to particularly valid at the current, in the current climate, where actually running studies in large, institutions, hospitals, is becoming more and more difficult. So it's now looking at community setting, using GPs and that kind of thing, which again that's not a new concept, but it's to start that process of really thinking exactly, how you're going to run your studies. And of course, the location of those sites is another critical part of this whole set of considerations around where and why and when and that kind of thing. And really, there's so many differences between countries and why you might want to run a study in one versus another, that again, it's important. And this is also informed by your market and of course your intellectual property plan. So this is again why we advocate to really have a good understanding of what those considerations are, because then again, the location of your sites, can be really informed by that. But the other part of that is that, different countries, different ethical requirements. The bar is different, but not really very much, actually. Most countries are aligned, of course, with legislation around, what will be expected, particularly through, I suppose, I'm surprised I actually haven't mentioned this earlier, but I'll mention it now, and I'll certainly mention it again. That, there's the standard of ISO 14155 for devices, then of course, in terms of drugs and everything else, ICH GCP. But no matter where you run your study, you still have to conform to those requirements. And I suppose, again, that's just something to keep thinking about as we go through this. But, again, your location, when you're thinking about running things in different countries, it always comes back to a few core things. Do you have the ability to really, truly oversee your study? Because at the end of the day, it's your study as a sponsor. You can delegate the running of that study to a CRO, but at the end of the day, the responsibility lies with you. So, understanding what the ramifications are of running studies in different countries is extremely important. And we've said US versus EU here, but even in terms of the EU itself, in different countries, I think we always advocate for understanding feasibility. What is the feasibility of actually running my study? What will I have to consider? Translation costs, for example, what am I going to have to do that? And, translation is looks like it's a simple thing to do, but actually in clinical research, translations take on a whole new meaning, in terms of translations, back translations and that kind of thing. So just to always be aware of these types of operational considerations in the background that can actually, unfortunately, turn up to be quite the consideration if they're not properly thought about. The patient pathway, again, another really important consideration. How is your product fitting into a standard of care? And again, in terms of the location, this becomes really, really important. So knowing how people are treated for a particular disease, and how your product might actually fit in versus how your product might actually warrant something like more visits to a hospital, which of course, again, at the moment is probably less than ideal. So again, these are all things that, influence also your trial design. Number of sites needed. Again, if you've got your design done properly and your sample size has been done properly, it will give you really what you need in terms of a good starting point for the number of sites. And again, unfortunately, we've the battle scars around this very, very important consideration, about the idea of sites over promising and saying that all numbers of patients will be promised this kind of thing. So the feasibility and what we call qualification work done here, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's really incredibly important to have an actual realistic picture, in terms of what sites are actually going to deliver for you and how many of them you need. And when you're doing that, this idea of competing studies, and I think unfortunately people think that once they build a good relationship with a potential PI at a site, that's it, that's really the biggest thing. And while it's important, what we can tell you from our experience is that unfortunately it does not end there. That's actually only the beginning. And there could be lots of reasons why. It doesn't matter how interested that clinician is in running your study. If her site is not willing to actually run it from an institutional perspective, then you won't be able to. So it's, again, just understanding that the resources, which is this last bullet, so that's on an institutional level, can be a really important consideration, and understanding how sites are set up and equipped to do that is very, very important. And of course, again, it's obvious, but competing studies at a site could actually mean that, they can take on your study, but your chances of getting any recruitment could be absolutely slim to none. So that being said, there are ways to address this. And of course, robust feasibility assessment is one of them. And then, of course, planning and understanding, how far in advance you need to start getting together all of your documentation, which is very nicely outlined actually in ISO 141554 for the device people, and of course also well outlined in ICH and GCP. But planning for that and what's needed, very, very important. And of course, understanding your manufacturing timelines, mentioned that briefly before, but I can certainly tell you that, again, we've got the scars to prove that somehow, somewhere, some of these things slipped off someone's radar, and actually there have been unfortunate, scary stories of not even being able to run a study because actually the manufacturing wasn't considered in time and caused massive delays. So planning. Site management, of course, once you find your sites, it's building up that really important relationship. These are trained folks that are really helping you to do something incredibly important with your product. So ensuring that they have all the information they need and that they are set up to succeed is absolutely critical, and that can really also make or break a really good study. So as we've said, it's the testing strategy. That is the clinical development plan. So understanding everything, all of those moving pieces and how they may fit together. It doesn't have to be exact, but the sooner that you start thinking about all of those things and how they intersect, the better, because it really is going to make a huge, huge difference to your ability to come up with the right trials that will give you all of the data and the evidence that you need. So back to the scary slide, which I'm going to break down a little bit more to give you a bit more of a feel for, what's involved in the running of the study. And again, I really can't say too much about the ISO 14155 because it does a super job of spelling this out and spelling out the responsibilities of running a study and all of the different things that you need to consider. So here we have our chap here, which again, we've seen in terms of sponsors taking on these massive responsibilities. There's clearly a lot of work that has to get done, a lot of balancing and a lot of scary moments. However, that being said, here we are with, I suppose, in terms of the planning, talking about protocol writing and what we have, in terms of there's the SIP, which many of you will be familiar with in the device world, and also, understanding what goes into that's really, really important. We talked a lot about trial design, so I won't go into that. The same thing with sites, the capability and the capacity to recruit, absolutely critical. The patient engagement side of things, again, particularly, for example, in the UK, that's a mandatory requirement when you're designing your study. So understanding the where and when, I am going to go back to that, sorry. Understanding the where and when for your patient engagement is absolutely critical. It's gone blank, sorry. So this, again, differs between countries, but what I will say is that actually in terms of trial design, this is really, really, really important. Understanding, particularly depending on your intervention, what are you asking people to do, and understanding, is it feasible to run a certain type of study? Are people going to want to participate in your study? And if not, why not? So that's really patient engagement from our perspective, incredibly important, because that's where you will get that understanding of, what types of things. I'm going to have to remove this animation. Sorry, guys. So what types of things need to be considered here? Again, we've talked about a lot of these things, so I won't belabor them too much. Human factors testing, we get asked about that a lot. And of course, again, it's still a study and it's still understanding how you do that with potentially certain products that aren't CE marked. And again, there's good ways to do that, and it's important to plan. And just the last bit here about expert consultation, again, that's, getting clinician input here, very, very important. I think, everyone should know that already, but there are other experts involved in this entire process that can provide really, really important information. So your biostats, I'm just going to let that run. Your biostats people, for example, people that have experience in data management, and, you're going to be collecting data. And actually, this is something to speak about here, which I'll come back to. But once you've done all of these things, you're into setting up your study. You've spent all that time designing the right study, which is fantastic. So now you're basically looking at all these other important tasks that have to get done. And, the amount of study document creation, again, that's really nicely spelled out in the ISO about all the different things. And there, we talk about some of them here, for example, obviously your informed consent and advertisements, but your study monitoring plan, if you're collecting any kind of bloods, what's the specimen management plan? Lots of things that have to be done, lots of documents that have to be created before you can go to your regulatory body. And so again, it's understanding how that all fits together. So she said, going back on her animation, this, another very important thing to consider, your study site budgets and contracts. Not only do you have to think about all of the time and the effort and the resources that you need to sort of plan and set up and manage your study, but obviously where you run your study, we'll take hospitals, obviously the most obvious example, really important to, make sure that you have a full understanding of all of the different line items and the costs that will be involved in running your study at any site. Now, the UK is a super example of a country that's done this incredibly well, where there's a great standardization. So the industry costing template, the ICT process has really come such a long way in the UK, for example, and it really does streamline that entire process of, you know, making sure you account for all of the potential costs in running your study. Now, obviously, in order to do that, you need a protocol, you need a SIP, you need a document that spells out exactly how you're going to run that study and what you expect those sites to be able to do. So you need to do that before you can actually have an idea of what your study and site budgets. So I hope that that's fairly self-explanatory. And of course, you know, very quickly, we already talked a little bit about regulatory and ethics, but again, there's processes. Some countries, it depends in terms of you may need to submit to a competent authority in addition to your ethics committee. It can be done in parallel in some countries. Sometimes it can't. It has to be done sequential. Again, these are all things to know and understand as you go on this journey and looking and talking about site feasibility. So again, once all that's done, your study site setup, again, we talked briefly before about the importance of site training. So that's the role of, in the industry, what we would have called a CRA, clinical research associate, or a monitor. These are folks that are very well versed and understand exactly what's involved in trying to get a site ready to run your study. So again, in that little hexagon, there's a lot of work. You have to develop training materials, and you have to fully understand who's going to be involved at your site in terms of your study coordinator and your PI and that kind of thing. So it is definitely worthwhile making sure that there's somebody involved in this study site setup that really and truly knows what they're doing. In terms of data management, I think, again, so much here, but really, you know, you're going to the trouble of running a clinical study. So exactly what data you're collecting, where, when, and why is of paramount importance, right? So we call it a DMP, a data management plan. You will need one of these. It's really, really important because it will also make sure that you have thought about the data in terms of anything to do with, you know, particular assessments, how are you going to actually assess any kind of clinical endpoint, all of those considerations which will come from, you know, your trial design and your protocol. This is where I suppose where the proverbial rubber hits the road, in that your data management plan will allow you to understand how you want to collect that. And again, really important to understand that, you know, in many respects, the old Excel spreadsheet is really no longer a robust way, not that it ever really was, but again, just to mention that that becomes incredibly important in terms of understanding the type of system that you may need to actually gather the data, so that again, you can provide that data to a statistician at the end of your study who can produce something meaningful from it. So again, this is all about considering what those might look like, and we call them CRFs. It's another acronym there for you, case report forms, but that's how you're going to, you know, structure the collection of your data. So important to think about that. Trial master file creation, the TMF. This is about collecting all of the documentation that you need to essentially capture and make sure is stored and collected in an appropriate way. You know, originally this was all very much around, you know, what would be needed to reconstruct the study. And obviously that's still of critical importance, but it also provides a really important audit trail, so that if your study is audited for any reason, you've collected everything and that the information is there for, you know, for the auditor to go back through. You know, for example, with MHRA as a competent authority, they could potentially audit, as of course the notified body can. So just very quickly to just point out that, again, a lot of this has been paper-based in the past, but there are electronic systems out there. They're not cheap, but depending on the extent of the study you're involved in, you know, you may need to consider that. So in terms of running the study itself, as I mentioned before, key things here: study monitoring. You know, the running of the study is very much about the assurance of the data you're collecting and the safety of any participant within that study. So again, the role of a good study monitor here is really, really important, because they can work with the sites to just, make sure they have all the support and information that they need, and that they're collecting data, and that data is what we call clean. So they do a lot with addressing queries, and again, really, really important folks to have involved in your study, because again, in terms of patient safety, they're there to monitor the safety of those patients on your behalf. Oh, my animation really wants to run ahead of me here. Sorry about that. So again, with patient safety, a whole set of reporting requirements here, particularly if there are anything unexpected that would happen with your product. And there's a set of requirements around the type of reporting, the extent of the information needed. So again, having people that are experienced in supporting the site to do that's really, really critical. And, again, there's, depending on how long your study is going on for, but there are, of course, reporting requirements that also, continue during the length of the study. So again, important to understand what that is, and when, and who's going to do it, and what kind of information needs to be provided. And, funnily enough, project management, which is just off here to the corner, but actually it's the project management aspect of all of this that is key, and that can be an absolute full-time job. But I'm sure there's potentially companies out there that would attest to having the scars for that, where they've tried to run studies themselves, being also trying to run their companies, and have found out that there's just huge amounts of work and coordination. And I think probably you are starting to get an idea of the extent of that. But again, keeping an eye on all of these moving parts as your study progresses, all of your responsibilities, all of the different things that need to be, I suppose, orchestrated to make sure that they happen at the right time, really, really, really important here. And at the end, it becomes worth it, because, you have your clinical study report, and hopefully you've gone through this entire process of running your study. And, again, the benefit and the reason for doing that is so that you have gathered enough good, robust evidence about your product. So pulling that together into a meaningful document, very, very important. And again, fantastic medical writers, biostatisticians, folks like that out there to help do all of that and make sure that it's in, not only the right template, but, that you have the story of your product told in the right way. For clinical evaluation reports, again, there's kind of stuck down here at the bottom, but actually really important consideration also actually at the beginning, because in many cases, you will need at least a draft of this to actually inform the development of your SIP, your protocol. But what you do then is, once you've actually conducted your study, you go back to your clinical evaluation report and you update it, and you put the information in on the performance of your study. And then you're at the end where you can submit to your regulatory body with all of that wonderful information that you've gone through blood, sweat and tears to gather, and it will hopefully have all been worth it. So that being said, a lot of information to throw at you, but unfortunately, yes, on the road to success, there are no shortcuts. There are some shortcuts, certainly not for this guy in his truck here, but really, it's planning. It's planning, and it's planning, and it's planning. And I think, hopefully you have an understanding of why that planning is so critical, because of all of these different moving pieces that have to get done. And this, again, is in no way meant to, dishearten anybody or scare anybody, because there's processes and there's people out there to help that do a super job of this. And the whole point, though, is once you understand what it is you need to do, then you can look at budgets properly, and you can understand actually how there may be ways to streamline. We won't say shortcut, but we'll certainly say streamline. And, it really is about avoiding surprises, because there shouldn't really be any, because if you plan correctly and look at all of these different things, then the whole point is so that you don't get hit with something that you weren't expecting. And I think it's probably no secret to many of you that clinical trials are not cheap. That they're just not. There's so many different things that have to get done. I think hopefully I've given you an understanding of how different experts get involved and different people that will make a huge difference to the success of your study. And these are all folks that, have a job to do, and, that basically costs money. But all, again, we will say is having a good plan and knowing what that is and being committed to it. Again, from what we've seen, talking to investors is what they like to see. And they like to see people being realistic and knowing that this is the journey that they're on, and that they've planned for it, and that they know that, and that they embrace it, and that they're going to, be upfront and say, well, this is how much money we need to do that. And I suppose if I could say one thing, you absolutely cannot ask people to tell you how much your trial is going to cost, for the very reason that unless you know exactly what your trial is, there are way too many variables to try and understand before you can even get to a ballpark. So I used to like to say to people, yeah, I can tell you how much your trial costs. I can give you any number that you want. What are you in the mood for? You want to spend 10,000, or you want to spend 1 million? And, all I can say is that without the trial plan, without knowing what and why you are doing, it is absolutely impossible to estimate costs. But I would advocate always to go through the right exercise to make sure that you have the right trial, and then you'll know what you're up against. So these are just some of the myths that we always like to try and dispel when we get the opportunity. So I'm hoping that, of course, this won't apply to anybody listening to this today. But again, these are situations and scenarios that we've run into that have just caused not just consternation, but also, the lack of understanding again of what this journey is and what it entails. And at the end of the day, if you want to run a study, you know what, you can test it on yourself, but I wouldn't advise it. And not only that, your regulators or on your market are going to look for more than that. So and please don't for your own sake, test it on yourself. So always read the label, always use the right experts. And I'm laughing, it's actually not funny. And we have unfortunately seen some not great stuff with people running out and testing different things without getting any kind of regulatory or ethical approval. And saying you don't need ethics, actually 9 times out of 10 you absolutely will. And I don't want to go into what the 1 in 10 chance might be where you don't. There's literally barely any scenarios where you won't. If you want to ask people questions and involve them in any kind of research, you should be going through an ethical approval process for that. I know someone who said we can try the product. I know I mentioned this earlier, but I have to say that we plead with people to understand that that's only the start of the conversation. And great, you have an interested doctor, fantastic. However, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So really, it's about understanding that institution where that doctor is based and what their levels of acceptance are in terms of what their workload, in terms of resourcing, all of these different things. So when I talked earlier a little bit about feasibility, that's understanding that that's brilliant that doctor has said yes, but there's a much bigger audience of people that you will have to go through in order to actually get your study sanctioned. So we don't need statistics. So I suppose, again, mentioned this a little bit earlier, and it was in the past that, a lot of times people got away with mirroring other studies that were done and saying, you know, we think this would be a good number. And of course, doctors themselves are a bit naughty for always saying you only need this many people. The simple fact is, know why you need the number of patients that you need, and the only way to really do that is through a power calculation done by a qualified biostatistician. Because the last thing you want to do is actually have running a study on 50 patients when potentially you could only run it on 32 of them. So not a great example, but what I'm trying to say here is that powering your study the right way gives you the right number of patients, not too many and not too few. So I hope that that's clear. And it's, again, we're going to do, you know, our study in X country, you know, Q any number of Eastern European countries where people seem to think that they can run cheap clinical trials, and the answer is not necessarily. And by, you know, don't get me wrong, absolutely. I've run studies in many different countries, you know, that have been significantly cheaper than running them, say, in the US. But more and more that is less likely to be the case. And I think, again, this all comes back to doing feasibility the right way, really knowing and understanding what it is you're getting into. You know, again, we've seen this particularly with budgets and arguments over budgets, but that doesn't really, it doesn't really, I suppose the whole point is that know what it is you're getting into in these different countries. What makes the difference? I think I may have probably talked about this more than anyone wants to hear anymore, but, you know, your design, the selection of the right docs. You know, we always advocate for physicians, all different kinds of physicians. You know, your KOLs can be very oversubscribed, so to think about that a little bit more. Sites we've talked about, and recruitment. Most clinical studies fail because they can't get enough patients. So cue the need for the right sample size here again. Timelines, I don't think I need to say that any more than what I've said already. And so that's it. And, you know, again, I'm going to leave you with the take-home slide here, very much around, there's a lot of work to do in this game. And, you know, but planning for it makes the difference. And absolutely, you know, work with the right people that can help you. And again, my hat is off to absolutely everyone that goes on this journey, because it is not an easy one. But, you know, without entrepreneurs and without startups and without folks like yourselves, we'd never make any progress, right? So it's a privilege for companies like mine to be able to serve and to work with so many of you out there. And, you know, again, just remember, you're in the evidence business. You know, we all are. This is very much about, you know, if you've gone to the trouble of developing what you think is something great, then let it have its chance in the sun to prove that that's it. Oh no, that's me. Stop.
Thank you, Nicola. Do you think we could go through a couple questions before? I think we're probably going to, at the top of the hour, we often get a little bit of drop off, but perhaps we could go through a few of the questions that have been dropped into the Q&A.
Yes,
awesome.
Indeed.
I think in a nutshell, though, planning is important. I found myself struck by this. First of all, this gorgeous reminder that clinical trials are fundamentally about taking care of people. It's not about tripping you up on some regulatory approval or about getting a reimbursement code. It's all about safety and care. And I also found myself wondering, all of this press about exceptional, compassionate use and so forth this year, I wonder actually how much reputational damage it's doing. I wonder, do we have startups that think that maybe compassionate use might be the norm rather than the exception? And what we're really hearing in this webinar is planning is absolutely key. So enough of my random thoughts on the topic. Let's have a little look at some of these questions. So the first we have, I think we're probably going to see a good deal of the question of clinical trial need for certain types of startup or usage, to which I would remind you all that Nicola is available via the Mentoring and Coaching Network. Okay, so first question was, do you think we need clinical trials for a rehabilitation system?
The answer is, I don't know. It depends. It depends. And the only way to find out is to go through that process to see if you do need it. It depends on your market. It depends on all of the things that we talked about. It's impossible to say. And I
Exactly.
would never, ever dream of giving any kind of arbitrary, off the cuff answer to a really important question like that. I think it
Exactly.
depends.
Okay, amazing. A question that I'm not knowledgeable enough to understand, but I will read to you. Powering calculation is complex and specialist. Do you have any more user-friendly ways to do this in-house?
You can do it in-house. There's all kinds of programs out there to do it, but I would hope I've made my point that you shouldn't. Unless you have a background in maths and statistics and you really understand, and some people do, and we've come across clients that have, and it's fantastic. But again, if I can advocate for the biostats out there, that those folks are just remarkable and worth every penny of what it takes to employ them to do certain things, because they could end up saving you so much money in the long run. So if you think about it like that, rather than thinking about what you're saving, I would really hope that that would be the time for that.
If I could as well hark back to one of the Startup Toolbox webinars that we had earlier on, John Bessel talked about recruitment. And one of the things that really struck out for me from that webinar is that you can't be afraid to use a consultant, because in fact, the upfront costs of consultancy are often cheaper than hiring somebody for the long haul and all that is required with that. So something to think about. Okay, next a quick one. Oh, this is easy. Under study site budgets and contracts, you mentioned that the UK has a great template done out. Where can we access this?
I can send you guys the link, but if you just Google industry costing template UK, it'll probably come up with a link. Now, this
Okay.
process has changed. So again, it's understanding how to navigate that. But just if you Google it, it should come up. Otherwise, Rosemary, we can send you guys the link after the study.
No problem. And finally, how do studies for new diagnostic methods compare to classic clinical trial? Looking at how a new solution fits in the diagnostic pathway is quite different to analyzing the treatment pathway.
Absolutely, which is why, again, you need to understand what it is that you need and to get the right people around the table to do that. Because, again, every situation and every scenario is different. And I think that's unfortunate, because people want to have a standard answer, and there are none anymore. And again, you should be looking at the best ways to answer your key questions. And it all comes down.
The reminder that clinical trials are about protecting people is so pertinent there, because we're all trying to protect people in very different ways. And of course, the ways that we trial that would naturally be really different. Nicola, this has been absolutely wonderful. It's so nice to have you. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thanks, Nicola. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Ella.
Everybody have a lovely afternoon. We hope to see you next week for the final 3. Lots of cool topics on marketing and selling, and getting your ideas out there after they've been clinically validated. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.